لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. Are we live? We're not live on YouTube. Not showing up in the videos. Okay, sorry. I apologize for that. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. In our lessons on Jawhara al-Tawhid of Imam al-Laqqani with the commentary of Imam al-Sawi, we have reached the section on the relationships of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in this section, we have, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, looked at the rationally established divine attributes and their relationships. And we saw also the wisdom for why Imam al-Laqqani arranged the mention of the attributes in the way that he has. It was not just incidental, but it is actually very purposeful. And we touched briefly on something that we will be looking at further as we go through the completion of the discussion on divinity, which is the issue of qada and qadr, right? Of divine decree and destiny. And because what is destiny? Qadr is basically the manifesting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, of the manifesting of the actual originated relationship of Allah's attribute of power, right? Qadr is the manifesting of the ta'alluq al-Tanjizi al-Hadith, of the manifesting of the actual originated relationship of Allah's eternal attribute of power, in accordance with the actual eternal relationship of Allah's attribute of will, in accordance with the relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attribute of irada, the ta'alluq al-Tanjizi al-Qadim of Allah's irada. And qada is this actual eternal relationship of Allah's attribute of will, what Allah actually specified eternally, the ta'alluq al-Tanjizi al-Qadim of Allah's attribute of will, in accordance with Allah's attribute of knowledge and its ta'alluq al-Tanjizi al-Qadim, the actual eternal relationship of Allah's attribute of knowledge. And we looked at that, and we diagrammed that. We shared with those of you who are in the class the diagram of that, and that would be something good to formally diagram and to make a resource for this course as well, right? After getting it approved, etc. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for clarity in this. In order to understand the investigations related to the attributes of Allah, the attachments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes, because it's a sensitive discussion, we need to note the definitions very clearly. Someone sent a question, and if we were in boot camp, I would say please do 100 push-ups, right? Because while it's good that a question was asked, it was a very lax question, right? And the questioner can do much better than that. because for a student of knowledge, and when studying something precise, precision is critical. Just to say something very general and vague, that is it true that, so is this, and this, that? No. What are we talking about? What's an attachment? What is a ta'alluq? Right? A ta'alluq, what is the relationship of Allah's attribute is اقتضاء الصفة معنى زائد معنى زائدا عن قيامها بالذات. The relationship of Allah's attribute is the attribute entailing a meaning beyond its being affirmed for the entity. Right? It's a very precise definition. That is what a relationship is. We have to capture that. That's a relationship. The relationships conceptually can be potential and actual. The relationships then can be eternal or originated, right? Insofar as what they باعتبار المتعلق به, insofar as what they relate to. And to be clear about those definitions, one can then navigate through the section. We're not going to review the whole section from last time. You have the recording, but this is an area where it is critical, and we strive our utmost not to veer an inch from the way the ulama carefully define these things, right? So there's a question, I just archived the question because it is unbecoming of the questioner or of the subject to have a question like that, right? If you quote a term, even in transliteration, quote it properly, right? And ask precise questions, right? And return, in thinking, we return back to the definitions of things. And I just have reshared the definition. What is an attribute? And then what is an attachment? The attachment can be potential, saluhi, or suluhi, or tanjizi, potential or actual, or effective, right? Then it can be eternal or originated in the relationship, insofar as what it relates to. And then we've looked at the attachments, and we said it's very important to make a chart of each of the attributes and the types of its attachments, the nature of its attachments, and what its types of its relationships, the nature of its relationship, and what it relates to. Some of you have submitted that, others have not, but that is critical. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay. So we reached the second half of line 35. وَمِثْلُ ذَا كَلَامُهُ فَلْنَتَّبِعْ. And likewise his speech, so let us follow. Right? قوله قال الشارح وهو الإمام أحمد الصاوي رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم. قوله ومثل ذا كلامه, and likewise his speech, قال رحمه الله اسم الإشارة عائد على العلم. Right? ومثل ذا أي مثل العلم كلامه. Right? أي إن كلام الله تعالى كعلمه في وحدته وعدم تناهي متعلقاته وكونه يتعلق بالواجبات والجائزات والمستحيلات. Meaning that truly Allah Most High's speech is like His knowledge in its being one. Right? Now, and so Allah's knowledge is one attribute, and it being limitless in what it relates to. And also, like Allah's speech is like His knowledge in that it relates to the necessary, possible, and impossible. However, the nature of the relationship differs. لكن تعلق العلم تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف. However, the relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is a relationship, a ta'alluq of encompassing and disclosure. أي دون سبق خفاء. A disclosure without ever having been hidden because it's not acquired. وَتَعَلُّقُ الْكَلَامِ تَعَلُّقُ دِلَالَةٍ. But the nature of the relationship of Allah's speech is of indication. Here, there's an important point, and a lot of people are negligent about this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that all prophets were sent with the tongue of their people. And you have to, in order to be able to be a person who conveys knowledge in the age you are in, you need to appreciate the language and usage of the age you are in. Right? Which is why it is critical for any student of knowledge to have an active plan of how they are building their Arabic language, building out the breadth and depth of their classical Arabic, but also how they are able to connect with the living language of modern religious Arabic. Right? Not so you can speak in Egyptian colloquial or whatever, although knowledge of colloquial is important because a lot of scholars speak in colloquial in their lessons, particularly Egyptians, but not only, right? But also so that one is able to address, because in this state expression that we just looked at, fi wahdatihi, the word wahda, switch off the kettle. Wahda, oneness, right? Hini, in classical Arabic means كون الشيء واحدا, right? في وحدته, right? In its oneness, you could put here في كونه واحدا, right? In its being one. Because in modern Arabic, wahda has acquired the distinctive modern usage of union. So he said wahdatul ummal, the union of workers, right? You have wahdatul Arab, the unity of the Arabs, meaning it coming together to form one. And this causes modern dilemmas with certain classical terms, which have had classical challenges in the pre-modern era. There's been differences between the theologians and the philosophers and the Sufis on certain terminology, but also in terms of just understanding. So lest you say things that, because people don't speak according to the language of the ulama, and you need to be aware of that, and that's something you need to build, and that's why you need an active mentorship in your knowledge journey. So he says, فَكَلَامُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى يَدُلُّ عَلَى. So Allah's knowledge relates to the Allah's speech is one. It has no limit in what it relates to. It relates to the necessary, possible, and impossible. Its relationship is one of indication, dilala. So now this fa is now to detail. فَكَلَامُهُ تَعَالَى يَدُلُّ عَلَى كُنْهِ ذَاتِهِ وَجَمِيعِ كَمَالَاتِهِ. So the speech of Allah points to the reality of His entity and all His perfections. So this is from the necessary. وَحَقِيقَةِ الْكَائِنَاتِ عَلَى مَا سَتُوجَدُ عَلَيْهِ كَعِلْمِهِ. And it also points to the reality of originated things, on how they will be, just as His knowledge does. Right? Allah's speech relates to all the possible. He just gives one illustrative example. Allah's speech indicates all that will be, but it indicates all the possible. All that will be is just one subset of it, right? وبهذا تعلم صحة ما تقدم من أن الكتب السماوية دلت على بعض مدلول الكلام النفسي. From this, you will appreciate the soundness of what was stated previously, that the revealed books, and meaning ما أنزل الوحي المنزل على الرسل, right? يعني الوحي al-Munazzal, meaning the revelation that came down على الرسل, right? نفسه, right? Itself, right? للذي بين أيدينا, right? Not what is between our hands today, right? Because we know that's not that does not only indicate the divine speech, it is admixed and altered, etc., right? That the revealed books point to some of what is indicated by the eternal divine attribute of speech, al-kalam al-nafsi, the divine speech itself. وإلا لو كان القرآن مثلا دالا على جميع مدلول الكلام النفسي لساوى علم نبينا علم الله تعالى. Because otherwise, if the Quran indicated all that is indicated by the eternal divine attribute of speech, then the knowledge of our Prophet ﷺ would be equal to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لأنه أي لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, right, because he, i.e. the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, right, أعطي جميع علم القرآن, because the Prophet ﷺ was granted complete knowledge of the Quran. وهذا كفر بالإجماع, and this would be disbelief to say that the Prophet's knowledge is equal to the knowledge of Allah. That would be affirming similitude between creation and the Creator in one of the attributes of the Creator, and the Creator has told us ليس كمثله شيء, there is nothing like unto him. There is no resemblance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no similitude in his entity, in any one of his attributes, nor in any of his actions, subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلِلْكَلَامِ ثَلَاثَةُ تَعَلُّقَاتٍ, right? The divine speech has three relationships. تنجيزي قديم وهو تعلقه بذات الله تعالى وصفاته والمستحيلات وأخبار الكائنات قبل وجودها. An actual eternal relationship, which is it's relating to the necessary, the entity of Allah and His attributes, and to the impossible, and all report related to originated things before they exist. وصلوحي قديم, and a potential eternal relationship هو صلاحيته لخطاب من لم يوجد, and there is a potential eternal relationship which is Allah's speech can potentially relate to addressing anything that could exist. وتنجيزي حادث, and there is an actual effective originated relationship, وهو خطابه بالفعل لمن وجد, which is Allah actually addressing those who are originated, right? And this is there's some discussion on the issue of the attachments of Allah's attribute of speech, but this is a coherent presentation of it, right? So it has three attachments: تنجيزي قديم, صلوحي قديم, تنجيزي حادث. A potential eternal relation, an actual eternal relationship which is with the necessary and the impossible. A potential eternal relationship which is Allah's speech could address anything of the possible. And an actual originated relationship which is Allah's actual address to some of the possible with what they are addressed with. And here, if you look at Bajuri, for example, he's a little tighter in some of his expression on this, but Imam Sawi's commentary is characterized by being easier and more discursive. فلنتبع, so let us follow. أي فلنتبع القوم فيما التزموه وَنُعَوِّلُ عَلَيْهِمْ. So let us follow the people of the science. Al-Qawm, the people of this science, meaning the Imams of Ahl Sunnah, and to rely on them. لأنهم الفرقة الناجية التي قال فيها سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم افترق من قبلكم 72 فرقة وستفترقون 73 فرقة فرقة ناجية والباقون في النار. That of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when we saw that in the first part of the book, that my community, that those before you divided into 72 sects, and you will divide into 73 sects. One saved sect and the rest in the fire. The rest in the fire. So this hadith tells us what we know this clearly from the hadith is that there is a mainstream within Islam. The saved sect is the mainstream of the ummah, right? Is the mainstream of the ummah. What is the breakdown of the 73 sects? And is 73 meant literally or figuratively, insofar as that there will be numerous sects? We cannot, whether we say it's literal, we don't know exactly how that demarcation is, because it's very possible to classify one type of sect, like the Mu'tazila, for example, or the literalists, as one sect, or you could break them down into the subgroups, right, etc. But the point is that you will have even more division than those who came before you. But there will be a mainstream. This, yani, firqatun najiyah, one group that is saved, min haythu salamatul i'tiqad, right? One group that is saved, min haythu salamat al-i'tiqad, right? Insofar as it has sound beliefs, it has the sound salvific beliefs. وَالْبَاقُونَ فِي النَّارِ, and the others in the fire, right? Okay. The others are in the fire, meaning that they would be deserving of the fire. This being deserving of the fire is either eternally or temporally. And those who are temporally deserving of the fire, they may be punished, they may not be punished. Doesn't mean that the people of every sect are eternally in the hellfire. That's not what's meant. Firqatun finnar, in terms of they're being deserving of punishment in hellfire, right? And those who are in the fire, the ulama say that there are four categories of those who deserve punishment. There are those sects that have an ascription to Islam, but who left Islam or remained outside Islam. Why? Kufran, out of kufr, right? بإنكار معلوم من الدين ضرورة, by denying something that is necessarily known to be of the religion, right? So some sects, right, are of this nature, right? That they denied the finality of the Prophet ﷺ, they affirmed the divinity of so and so, and others because of their bid'ah, because of their innovations, right? Their gross divergence from the way of the Prophet ﷺ in matters of belief, right? By denying the beatific vision in the hereafter, by affirming that the servant creates their own actions, etc. So there's a group of, so the Mu'tazila, the Shia, etc. They're Ahl al-Bid'ah. They're of the people of innovation. They diverge from what is clearly established from prophetic teachings. But in of themselves, they do not commit, they're not disbelievers. There's others who have fisq fil i'tiqad, who we wouldn't say they're mubtadi'ah. Some distinguish between Ahl al-Bid'ah, those who have major innovations in their, as a group, like as a body of beliefs, they have fundamental divergences from the mainstream. There's others who have fisq fil i'tiqad. In certain points, they have a fundamental error. And there's a number of beliefs like this. Then there's others who erred on certain points. That in that point, they have ithm. That they have i'tiqadat mu'athima. They had minor differences, that too. And they differed what is the threshold for being considered a firqa. And most likely, it would apply to the first three of the four, right? Kufr, bid'ah, or fisq, fil i'tiqad. But short of disbelief is mukhallid. Denial of belief makes one deserving makes one punished in the hereafter. But those who have bid'ah fil i'tiqad or fisq, etc., we do not affirm that they're actually in hell. Right? Means that they're deserving of hell. These are grades of sin. And we'll be looking that sin does not require punishment in the hereafter. That returns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll look at that later in the text. Then he tells us, وَكُلُّ مَوْجُودٍ أَنِطْ لِلسَّمْعِ بِهِ كَذَا الْبَصَرِ إِدْرَاكُهُ إِنْ قِيلَ بِهِ قَوْلُهُ. So, and every existent thing, ascribe his knowledge to it, likewise, ascribe his hearing to it, likewise his seeing and his cognition if it is affirmed. قوله أنط للسمع أي علق السمع به. Ascribe his knowledge to it, meaning affirm that his hearing is attached to it. Meaning believe that Allah's attribute of hearing relates to all existent things. تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف, with a relating of encompassing and disclosure. With the disclosure that is absolute but distinct to knowledge in a manner that we do not, that we consign its reality to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كذا البصر, likewise his seeing, أي فهو كالسمع يتعلق بالموجودات. Meaning that likewise his seeing, meaning that his seeing is like his hearing in that it relates to all existent things. تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف, with the relating of encompassing and disclosure. وقوله إدراكه, and likewise his cognition, معطوف على البصر بحذف العاطف. This is in conjunction with basar in the line of poetry, without mention of the the particle of conjunction, the waw, for example. قوله إن قيل به, if affirmed. أي إن الإدراك على القول بثبوته يتعلق بالموجودات. That the attribute of cognition, if affirmed, and we said, Ahl Sunnah said to have tawaqquf, like the mainstream position amongst the Ash'aris, and many of the muhaqqiqeen of the Maturidis, and there's discussion on that. One can find a really excellent summary of that in Isharatul Maram of al-Bayadi. It's also discussed with his own take on it by Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam in Al-Musayara, even though Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam is not always representative of the majoritarian position of the Maturidis. وقيل إنه يتعلق بالملموسات والمذوقات والمشمومات كما سبق. And there's an opinion that Allah's attribute of cognition relates to the tangible, the tasted, the smelled, etc. But certainly in the understanding of the Ash'ari, they don't affirm an attribute called idrak. There's no need to deny it. But what those who affirmed it sought to affirm through it is affirmed through the attribute of knowledge. And there's no textual basis for affirming these to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلِلسَّمْعِ وَمَا مَعَهُ ثَلَاثَةُ تَعَلُّقَاتٍ. And hearing and what comes with it, i.e. Seeing, has three relations. تنجيزي قديم وهو تعلقه بذاته وصفاته. An actual eternal relationship, and that is it's relating to the necessary, namely Allah's entity and His attributes. تعلقه بذاته وصفاته أي بالموجود الواجب. Right? By the existent things that are necessary. وصلوح قديم وهو تعلقه بذواتنا وصفاتنا قبل وجودنا. Right? أي بالموجود الممكن قبل وجوده. Right? The potential eternal relationship of Allah's hearing and seeing is with, He says, our entities and our attributes before our being originated. Namely, with the possible existent things before they come into existence. Right? So this is an example of what's called dilalatu tadammun. Right? The relationship between the expression and the meaning is one of, right, is partitive. And he mentioned as part of the definition that what is that التعلق الصلوحي القديم هو, the potential eternal relationship is تعلقه بذواتنا, is its relationship to our entities and our attributes. A is B here, that B is part of A. Right? Right? This is an example of the dilalat of what? Are you clear about that, Omar? So the تعلق الصلوحي القديم هو, right? So the identity is the تعلق الصلوحي القديم, the potential eternal relationship of Allah's hearing and seeing. Allah's hearing and seeing eternally potentially relates to all the possible existent things. Right? That is so A is B. To define it fully, you would say التعلق A, the potential eternal relationship of hearing and seeing is, it's relating to possible, is that it could potentially relate to anything possible that exists. Right? He gives an example of some of the potential possible things, meaning our entities and our attributes. And he does that for illustration. Right? So you could put الموجود الممكن, possible existent things, قبل وجود, يعني الموجود الممكن قبل وجوده, the possible existent things before they come into existence. وتنجيزي حادث, and hearing and seeing have a relationship that is actual and originated باعتبار المتعلق, insofar as what they relate to. وهو تعلقه بذواتنا وصفاتنا بعد وجودنا. Right? Which is it's relating, hearing and seeing relating to our entities and our attributes after we come into existence. Right? أي الموجود الممكن بعد وجوده. Right? Possible, existent things once they come into existence. So which points to that what we think about Allah hears you and He sees you, that's true insofar as it relates to you. But that's not all that's going on. Allah's hearing and seeing, Allah hears and sees Himself, all necessary things. Allah's hearing and seeing eternally relates to anything that could exist of the possible. Allah's hearing and seeing encompasses all of it, potentially. And it actually relates to all existent things, completely. So Allah hears and sees the visible and the invisible, the audible and inaudible, completely. But even that, just a speck in the reality, in the discernible reality of Allah's hearing and seeing. The ultimate reality of hearing and seeing, we make no attempt to claim knowledge of that. And then he says, وغير علم هذه كما ثبت ثم الحياة ما بشيء تعلقت. قوله, okay, so he says وتعلقه وتعلقاتها مختلفة, and their relationships, the relationships of hearing and seeing are distinct. ولكل خاصية لم تكن للأخرى, and each has distinct realities that are unique to it. وحقيقة ذلك لا يعلمها إلا الله, but the reality of that is only known by Allah. We can affirm what is affirmed, that which revelation affirms and intellect grasps. Beyond that, we stop. Right? وغير علم هذه, and these two are distinct from knowledge. اسم الإشارة مبتدأ عائد على الصفات الأربع أعني الكلام والسمع والبصر والإدراك. These, meaning these four attributes, hearing, seeing, speech, and cognition, if affirmed, are يعني أنها مغايرة للعلم في الحقيقة, meaning that each of these is distinct to knowledge in their realities. وَكَذَا بَعْضُهَا مَعْ بَعْضٍ, and likewise each of these with respect to the other. So each of the attributes is unique. What's the reality of the distinction in their uniqueness? We don't know. كما ثبت, as affirmed, أي بالأدلة السمعية, by transmitted evidence. لأن المدلول لغة لكل واحدة غير المدلول للأخرى, because the lexical sense of each of these attributes is different from the other. فوجه حمل ما ورد على ظاهره, so we affirm what is transmitted as affirmed. حتى يثبت خلافه, until the opposite is established. واتحاد المتعلق لا يوجب اتحاد الحقيقة, and two attributes sharing the same relationship insofar as what they relate to does not entail that they share the same reality, because the relationship of the attribute and what it relates to is distinct from the attribute itself. وسكت عن وحدة هذه الصفات, and the author of the Jawhara remains silent on the oneness of these attributes, أي عن كونها واحدة كالحياة, just as he remains silent about that with respect to the attribute of life. للعلم بها من وجوبها لأخواتها, because it's already established and reaffirmed for the preceding attributes. إذ لا فرق, because there's no distinction. Every attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. And that's where we'd encourage you to look up from the Ta'liqat al-Mardiyya of Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id al-Burhani rahimahullah ta'ala on the Hadiyya al-Ala'iyya, the 7 investigations related to each one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, largely taken from his teacher's work, Miftah al-Jannah by Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi rahimahullah ta'ala. أما وجوب التعلق فمستفاد من صيغة الأمر في قوله أنط. As for these relationships being necessary, it's understood by the command in أنط, ascribe. كما استفيد عدم تناهي متعلقاتها من أداة العموم التي هي كل. Just as the limitlessness of the relationships of hearing and seeing is understood when he uses the expression kul, and all existent things ascribe his hearing and seeing to. Right? Okay, so you need to diagram this section, right? This is one of the sections that some things you can coast through and say, okay, I get it. Other sections you can't, right? So some people live in the, in the shame of ignorance because they never put in the effort to get something properly, right? This is a kind of section where you need to nail down the core definitions. You need to chart it out. This is very clear. You have to think through the differences, and everything that's unclear, you need to ask your questions, right? Being able to parrot definitions of the attributes of Allah, although you'd be surprised how many ulama, or quote unquote ulama, can't do that. And that's just, someone who can't do that, they have to be, like if we had ihtisab, many people who are out there teaching anything technical, you just put a stamp, cease and desist, right? And in many Muslim countries, a part of ihtisab, they used to go and visit the madaris and places where they're teaching people in an unsound manner. They'd force them to shut down until they replaced the teachers, or the teachers went through retraining, because it's an amana, it's not a banana. That's from the duties of the ruler to ensure that, or the duties of the scholars amongst themselves to ensure that only those who, it's not just who hold a qualification, but whose teaching reflects the salahiyya, the capacity to convey, فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ, so they transmitted as was transmitted to them. And that's very important, but we need to take that very seriously ourselves, right? ثم الحياة ما بشيء تعلقت, and the attribute of life does not relate to anything, right? أي لأنها صفة أزلية تصحح لمن قامت به أن يتصف بالصفات المعاني والمعنوية, because it, meaning life, is an eternal attribute that makes it valid for the one characterized by it, in this case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be characterized by the affirmative attributes and the attributes of affirmation, the ma'ani and ma'nawiyya. فهي شرط في الجميع, so it is like a condition with respect to the remaining affirmative attributes, right? يرحمكم الله. هي شرط أي كالشرط, right? Right? It is a condition, meaning it is like a condition. في جميع الصفات ولا تقتضي أمرا زائدا غير حصول معناها لمن قامت به, and it, meaning life, does not entail any matter beyond the affirmation of its meaning for the one it is affirmed for. Life affirms that Allah is living, and it makes it, and it is therefore valid for the one characterized by it to have affirmative attributes, because affirmative attributes are not rationally sound to affirm for other than a being characterized by life. Of course, we had pointed you to reading and it's not been shared yet, right? The section from Shaykh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid's commentary notes on Abdul Salam al-Laqqani's sharh on his father's Jawhara. It's a brief section, a couple of pages, but he goes through what is the attribute of life, and what is life, how do the scholars understand life, what do we mean by an attribute called life, and then what does it mean to ascribe this attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gives a little background. Sawi deliberately skirts the whole discussion, right? And he's being careful, but in thoughtfully traversing a text like this, one would notice these things. والدليل عليها ثبوت تلك الصفات فحيث ثبتت هذه الصفات دل على ثبوتها أي الحياة. والدليل عليها, and the proof for the attribute of life is that the other attributes are affirmed for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So given that those attributes are affirmed rationally, with respect to the rationally affirmed attributes, knowledge, will, and power, and by transmission, namely speech, hearing, and seeing, given that we affirm these attributes, then it necessarily entails that necessarily rationally entails that we would affirm the attribute of life. And it's also, of course, affirmed by revelation. Huwa al-Hayyu al-Qayyum. He is the living, the all-sustaining, and elsewhere. فتحصل أن صفات الباري جل وعلا من جهة التعلق أربعة أقسام. So in summary, this is another thing that you could diagram very clearly, that the attributes of the originator, mighty and exalted, in terms of their relationships, are of four types. قسم لا يتعلق بشيء وهو الحياة. One category does not relate to anything. أي لا تقتضي معنى زائدا على قيامها بالذات. It does not entail any meaning beyond its subsisting through the entity. وهو الحياة, which is the attribute of life from the affirmative attributes. والصفة النفسية, right? أو الصفات النفسية, right? And the negative attributes. والصفات in the person, الصفة النفسية, sorry, slip of tongue. الصفة النفسية, the personal attribute, namely being. والصفات السلبية والمعنوية, likewise the negative attributes and the attributes of affirmation. وقسم يتعلق بجميع أقسام الحكم العقلي, and a category that relates to all categories of the rational ruling. يعني أي الواجب والجائز والمستحيل, the necessary, the possible, and impossible. وهو العلم والكلام, and these are knowledge and speech. لكن تعلق العلم تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف. However, the relationship of knowledge is a relationship of encompassing and disclosure. والكلام أي تعلق الكلام تعلق دلالة, and the indication of speech is an indication of, and the relationship of speech is a relationship of indication. وقسم والثالث قسم يتعلق بالممكنات. The third type of relationship of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those attributes that relate to the possible. وهو القدرة والحياة, and these are will and power, or power and will. وقسم يتعلق بالموجودات, and a category that relates to existent things. وهو السمع والبصر والإدراك على القول به, which is hearing and seeing and cognition if affirmed, if the third, cognition, is affirmed. Now, if you go ahead and read in the works of the Aqidah of Ahl Sunnah, there has been a minority of scholars who have said that hearing and seeing go back to the attribute of knowledge, just as there are other attributes that are affirmed, like mercy. What is mercy? Mercy goes back to will and power, right? What is lutf? gentleness, right? So many other of the, sometimes they call them sifatul kamal or as-sifatul jami'ah, the attributes of perfection, the encompassing attributes. They go back in meaning to these 7 attributes. So there is a minority who have said that, but that is a minority opinion. But don't start, kicking people out of Ahl Sunnah. That's firstly, that's not your duty, and secondly, it's beyond your knowledge. Okay. فالنسبة بين تعلق العلم والكلام الترادف. The relationship between the relationship of Allah's knowledge and speech is they're the same. Both relate to the necessary, possible, and impossible. وكذا بين القدرة والإرادة. Likewise, Allah's will and power have the same relationship. They relate to the possible. أما بين العلم والكلام مع غيرها. As for the relationship between knowledge and speech, and other than it, فالعموم والخصوص المطلق. It's the relationship between what is general versus what is specific, right? Because Allah's knowledge and power, Allah's knowledge and speech have the most general relationship. They relate to all the necessary, all the possible and impossible. So they're more general, and for example, will and power are more specific because they relate to one of the 3 types of rational ruling. They relate to the possible, which is a subset. Allah's hearing and seeing are a subset as well. It's Allah hears and sees all the necessary and the existent of the possible things. So its relationship is more specific. The relationship of hearing and seeing are more specific than the relationships of Allah's knowledge and His speech. So he's just laying out the implications. وبين تعلق القدرة والإرادة والسمع والبصر عموم وخصوص وجهي. And the relationship between Allah's will and power and His hearing and seeing is a relationship of عموم وخصوص وجهي. Each is more general in one sense and more specific in another. يجتمعان في الوجود الممكن. They intersect with respect to the possible existent things. وتنفرد القدرة والإرادة بالممكن المعدوم. But Allah's power and will relate exclusively to the possible that is non-existent. And Allah's hearing and seeing is exclusive with respect to, in contrast to His hearing, to His will and power, with respect to the necessarily existent. Because Allah's will and power do not relate to the necessary. It would be redundant or absurd. وَهُوَ ذَاتُ اللَّهِ وَصِفَاتُهُ. And that's Allah's entity and His attributes. And he brings this in because part of the purpose of classical text is to train you, right? It's to train you. That one of the ways you understand the implications and relationships between things, you have to understand where they overlap and intersect and where they are distinct from one another, right? So what's the relationship between 2 things? عموم وخصوص مطلق is one is absolutely more general and the other is absolutely more specific. Or they can be overlapping. It's called عموم وخصوص من وجهي. Each is more general in one way and more specific in another, and there is something that is shared between them. So they overlap. But each has what is distinct to it. Or it could be of absolute distinction. There's no overlap. There's 2 circles side by side, right? So you can, one thing can be more general and the other more specific completely, or they can overlap. Each has what's unique and what is shared, or they could just be no interrelationship. There are two circles side by side. One does not overlap with the other in any way. So that's the discussion on the attachments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes. Then there's in 2 lines, he then discusses an issue which we'll just introduce and we'll look at next class. He says, وَعِندَنَا أَسْمَاؤُهُ الْعَظِيمَةِ كَذَا صِفَاتُ ذَاتِهِ قَدِيمَةً. According to us, both his tremendous names and likewise his essential attributes are eternal. Right? And وَاخْتِيرَ أَنَّ اسْمَاهُ تَوْقِيفِيَّةً. And it is chosen that Allah's names are only established by revelation. You can't name Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with non-revealed names. كذا صفات. Likewise the attributes, فَاحْفَظِ السَّمْعِيَّةِ. So memorize the transmitted names. And it says it is chosen because there is discussion on this point. So he says, so we'll continue from line number 38, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And then he also discusses about the names of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we'll look at the issue of, so we'll continue from line 38 when we're coming to a very important investigation on transcendence. وَكُلُّ نَصٍ أَوْهَمَ التَّشْبِيهَ أَوِّلْهُ أَوْ فَوِّضْ وَرُمْ تَنْزِيهَ. Every text that would wrongfully indicate affirmation of would seem to indicate affirmation of similitude, أَوِّلْهُ, interpret it, أَوْ فَوِّضْ, or consign its meaning, but remain ever affirming of transcendence. So we'll look at this in this very sensitive issue, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and this is of course a source of a lot of commotion in our times. We'll also look at the various pathways of Ahl Sunnah with respect to this. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So we continue from line 38. Next we're going to be looking at our text in logic. We're looking at إيضاح المبهم, the Damanhuri's commentary on Sullam al-Munawraq of al-Akhdari, and we stopped at did we reach أنواع الدلالة الوضعية? Yes. Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So we're looking at some of the preliminaries to tasawwurat, to be able, how you conceive of things. And so he explains that conceiving of something can either be intuitive, not daruri, or nadari, or requiring reflection, right? And we then saw that and we looked at the definitions of those. And he explained in the last class that you have, mantiq is divided into two sections, at-tasawwur and tasdeeq, conception and confirmation. And then each of these have two halves: the bases, the mabadi', and the outcomes. Right? So the bases of conception are what's called the kulliyat al-khams, the 5 ways of categorizing something. And then the outcome, the maqasid, the aim of tasawwur is al-qawl al-sharih, is the defining statement, also called the hadd, the definition. And then in tasdeeq, in confirmations, you have statements and the things that relate to statements, and you have analogies or proofs, qiyas or al-hujaj. So we looked at that. And here there's a bunch of terminology, right? There's a bunch of terminology. Only a lazy person is scared of terminology. All you need with the terminology is know its definition and understand it. If you don't understand it, keep asking about it till you get it. Right? Then he says, أنواع الدلالة الوضعية, the types of indication, right? Of affirmed indication, the types of affirmed indication, right? And he'll explain that. So we are at line 24 of Idah al-Mubham, and have you shared the PDF of the Idah al-Mubham? So he says, rahimah, so the author of Sullam, line number 24 says, دلالة اللفظ على ما وافقه يدعونها دلالة المطابقة وجزئه تضمنا وما لزم فهو التزام إن بعقل التزم. Right? So the types of indication of words by their, so أنواع الدلالة الوضعية, the types of indication, and so this is أنواع الدلالة اللفظية الوضعية, the types of indication of words by their lexical sense or usage. Right? So it's دلالة اللفظ الوضعية, the indications of words by their lexical meaning and usage. Right? Right? And the reason, so this is pointing to something, as the commentator will explain, that the purpose of logic is the logician, the mantiqi, their purpose is meanings. Right? But meanings are only found through words, right? So logicians busy themselves with words, not because words are what their concern is, right? Because words, insofar as they're words, you have to go to the Department of Arabic in terms of what's the, where do words come from, the structure of words, the grammar of words, etc. That's not the concern of logicians. Logicians are concerned with meanings. But they need words insofar as they express meanings. Now, how do they express meanings? The role of, there's balagha and the sciences of balagha, right? Ma'ani, bayan, badi', the 3 sub-sciences of balagha, deal with how meanings are understood rhetorically, right? Beauty, appropriateness, eloquence, etc. But the logician's not interested in that either, right? Now, when is it good to refer to something as full-bodied versus plump, versus full, versus healthy, right? Versus overweight? Right? That's a rhetorical consideration, right? The grammarians say it's all correct, right? But that's why rhetoric is important. The logician is not interested in any of that. Although, of course, the things come together. Grammar deals with soundness of words and sentences. Logic looks at the preciseness of the meaning of words and statements, and from statements, arguments. Rhetoric, balagha, deals with the effectiveness of conveying the meaning intended. So, nahu, nahu meaning nahu and sarf together. So, lugha, nahu, sarf, right? So, grammar, and nahu has been used like grammar is in English to encompass, nahu, sarf, and also lugha, like just the root meanings of words. Lugha gives you the sound building blocks, sound words coming together for sound sentences. Logic then has to do with the soundness of the meaning conveyed. Are things soundly conceived of, that they're clearly defined, and that the statements are sound, they come together to make sound arguments. Right? So that is sound meanings. Right? Rationally sound meanings. And then rhetoric has to do with the effectiveness of conveying those meanings. But, so the scholar of logic, their role in this continuum of discourse is, the logician looks at words insofar as they're used for meanings. So that's why it's anwa' al-dilala al-wad'iyya, the types of indication of words by their meaning and usage, right? So this excludes a bunch of things, right? It excludes just non-verbal communication, the nod of a head, for example, right? Right? Or the natural indication of something, right? So, for example, a sign says, stop, do not proceed. The logician will look at that and say, stop means X, Y, Z. Do not proceed one is a word, one is a statement, this is what it indicates. That's what the logician would say is understood. There is a rational indication there, which is what? The existence of a sign indicates that someone placed a sign there. But that is not what is logically, that's not the duty of the logician. Right? Because logic looks at words insofar as they indicate meanings, tasawurat and tasdiqat. It looks at words. Now you can conceive, but it don't have to be spoken words. Right? So, and we'll look at that. So he says, line 24, dilalatul lafzi ala ma wafaqa, the indication of a word for its complete meaning, يدعونها دلالة المطابقة. They call it دلالة المطابقة, the indication of correspondence. Right? A is B when B indicates the full meaning of A. وجزئه تضمنا, and a part of a word indicating part of its meaning is called تضمن, partitive. أن يثبت شيء ضمن شيء آخر, for something to affirm within another thing. وما لزم فهو التزام إن بعقل التزم, and that which is entailed by another is called the relationship of entailment, دلالة الالتزام, if this is rationally entailed. So, the commentator says, أقول رحمه الله تعالى مراده بدلالة الوضعية اللفظية. What he means by the affirmed indication is what is affirmed, the indications of the words themselves. بدليل قوله في البيت دلالة اللفظ, because in the line itself he says the indication of a word. So this is دلالة الدلالة اللفظية الوضعية. ومراده في البيت دلالة اللفظ الوضعية. What he means in this line is the indication of words by their lexical sense. بدليل قوله في الترجمة الوضعية, in their وضع, in their placement and their usage. فقد حذف من كل من الترجمة والبيت ما أثبت في نظيره. وما أثبت نظيره في الآخر, وهو نوع من الجناس يسمى احتباكا. So this is a type of short form in the Arabic language. He did not mention in the heading a part of the meaning, and another part he didn't mention in the line itself. Right? Because the heading, which is what's the heading? أنواع الدلالة الوضعية. In the heading he does not mention al-lafz, and in the line he does not mention al-wada'. But what is meant is both things together, and this is from the usage of the Arabs, that that when summary is praiseworthy, then repetition is considered blameworthy. So, and Arabs were thinking people, right? So, in the title he does not mention the lafz, and in the line he does not mention al-wad'iyya, but both are intended. And this is a type of eloquent expression. It's called ihtibak. Right? That you have two overlapping expressions, each omits something that is mentioned in the other, but both are intended in both parts of the statement. أنواع الدلالة الوضعية دلالة اللفظ. So we're both talking about dilalat. What's the meaning? The chapter heading is أنواع الدلالة اللفظية الوضعية. دلالة اللفظ أي دلالة اللفظ الوضعية على ما وافقت. Right? So this is how it is understood. So then he breaks things down. الدلالة. And of course, why do the ulama do this? Why not just speak in verbose ways? One, because all of Islamic studies is not just acquisition of a body of knowledge, it is training the acquirer of that knowledge to have the tools of knowledge and the tools of thinking and the capacity to think. To what end? Not just to be sophisticated, but to fulfill the maqasid of ilm and to come to revelation with the capacity to فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, so that you can consider, right? To be of the people of insight. You can only be a people of insight, of rational insight, if you have the capacity to reason. أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ. Do they not think deeply? Do they not reflect deeply? Etc. Okay. وَالدِّلَالَةُ فَهْمُ أَمْرٍ مِّنْ أَمْرٍ. Indication is understanding one matter from another. Understanding a matter from another. فَهْمُ أَمْرٍ لِأَمْرٍ. And it's a good... in Arabic, dilala is a masdar. You say, دَلَّهُ عَلَى الشَّيْء. He pointed him, he indicated him to a thing, meaning he guided him to it. So dilala is one thing that is understood from another. That's what an indication is. Right? And it's a good brief definition. كفهمنا الجرم المعهود من لفظ السماء, such as our understanding that body that we all know from the word sky. Right? From the word sky. Right? Right? فلفظ السماء يسمى دالا. So the word sky is called indicating. Right? It's dal. والجرم المعهود, and the known body is madlul, is what is indicated. Right? So dilala, indication, has the indicator, sky, and what is indicated, which is the known body, that which is above us, etc. Right? وَالدَّلَالَةُ بِحَسْبِ الدَّالِ ستة أقسام. Indication with respect to with respect to the indicator, the dal, is 6 types. You need to diagram these. You can't go through logic being lazy, because if you're not reasoning, you want to learn the principles of reasoning. So please be diagramming this, right? لأن الدليل إما أن يكون لفظا كالمثال المتقدم, because the indication is either of the word, like the example, sky, indicating the meaning of the known body, أو غير لفظ, or it could be other than, the indication could be of other than a word, كالدخان الدال على النار, right? Such as smoke indicating a fire. Is there a word called smoke and it's indicating a fire? No. This is a non-verbal indication. وكل منهما إما أن يكون دالا بالوضع أو بالطبع أو بالعقل. And both words and non-words can indicate by their wada, by their placement, or by their بالطبع, or by their nature, or rationally. Right? Something can indicate by the meaning ascribed to it in language, or by طبع, by its nature, or rationally. Right? ومثال الدلالة غير اللفظية الوضعية, the example of an indication that is non-verbal by its placement, دلالة الإشارة على معنى نعم, is like the indication of a sign to the meaning yes. And cultures differ. Right? For example, what does a nod indicate? Hello? What does a nod indicate? Yes. So this is a non-verbal indicator. Why does it indicate yes? Bilwada. Because people have ascribed this meaning to the indication. When I went to Damascus, I went to the book fair. Within weeks of getting to Damascus, I had a long list of books that I needed or wanted. I'd go ask someone, do you have such and such book? They go like this. I didn't know that that means no. So I said, جيد, أي طبعة, which edition? And they'd find it really weird because they just said, no, I didn't know that pointing upward means no. I was really confused. What's up with these guys? Then somebody told me that, do you know what it means? It means yes. It was, right? That is بالوضع. Non-verbal indication بالوضع. ودلالة النقوش على الألفاظ, or the indication of letters to the words that they represent. Right? Like that, there's a non-verbal indication of letters. The L, the letter L, why does it indicate the sound la? Because that's non-verbally they agreed that this symbol indicates this sound. Right? So this is the indication of other than words to their بالوضع. Right? By its placement, by the ascription of a usage, of a meaning. ومثال الطبيعية, an example of a natural indication, دلالة الحمرة على الخجل. A non-verbal indication that is natural is the indication of someone's face reddening to their feeling shy or embarrassed. والصفرة على الوجل, or someone being pale, meaning that they're in discomfort or distress. ومثال العقلية, a non-verbal indication that is rational, دلالة العالم على موجده, the indication of creation of this world to its creator, to its originator. Right? تأمل سطور الكائنات فإنها من الحق لك رسائل. Reflect on the writing that is creation, for it is from the real to you, messages. But is there actual writing out there? No. فإنه, it is like letters insofar as indicates meanings. Rationally, creation points to a creator. But this is a non-verbal indication. It's a rational indication. The logician deals with this through statements. Right? So, if a logician comes, so a logician who's never heard about Islam says, what's the proof for Islam? You go, right? Like, so there's a dilala there. So what did we do? There's a dilala. Firstly, غير لفظية بالوضع. Right? A non-verbal indication by placement. I pointed up. I pointed around. That did this. Then I pointed up. Right? That's not a logical statement. But if I can turn, and then بالطبع, I look surprised. That indicates a meaning. Rationally, so what's the proof for the creation, for Allah? And I say this world, but I don't say how. There's a rational indication, right? But ومثال الدلالة دلالة اللفظ الوضعية, an example of the indication of words by the placed meanings for them. بالوضع دلالة الأسد على الحيوان المفترس, the indication of the word lion, أسد, to the predatory animal, to the particular predatory animal. والإنسان على الحيوان الناطق, or the human to the rational animal. ومثال الطبيعية دلالة الاثنين دلالة الأنين على المرض, an indication of words by a natural indication of words, the indication of moaning to some kind of ailment. Is not, that is a natural indication, not how are you feeling? And then ooh, right? That's not the lexical meanings of those words. That's just from this what's understood naturally by the sound. Someone's walking, they let kind of go right? So there's words but not by their wada, but by their taba, by that's a natural indication, right? وَأَحْ عَلَى أَلَمِ الصَّدْرِ like a cough. You say that indicates pain in the chest. But is not, the indication is not by the meaning placed for it, it's a natural indication. That's taba. وَمِثَالُ الْعَقْلِيَّةِ the indication of a word rationally دلالة كلام المتكلم من وراء الجدار على حياته. A rational indication of words is that you hear someone talking from behind the door, means that they're alive. Of course, assuming it's not a recording or something. Someone went to the toilet, nobody's answering. So you knock on the toilet, they say, right? They say, wait, because there's no lock on the door. When they say wait, you know that they didn't die in the toilet, right? But they didn't say I'm alive. What's the relationship between wait? From the word wait, you rationally understand that they're alive, for example. So that's the indication of the word. That is rational. So indication can be lafzi or غير lafzi, by words, or verbal or non-verbal. And each of these can be bil-wada, in the meaning that's placed for it, or by its natural indication, taba, or by its rational indication. So we've seen examples for and وَالصُّرَاخ عَلَى مُصِيبَةٍ نَزَلَتْ بِالصَّارِخ. Someone goes, right? Someone screams in distress, surah. You rationally understand that they're in distress. Typically. That's a reasonable indication. And there's some examples in logic are notoriously difficult to define. والمختار من هذه الأقسام واحد عند المناطق. What's chosen, right, by the scholars of logic, the scholars of logic busy themselves with one of the 6 types of indication. Not that the others are not of consideration, which is الدلالة اللفظية الوضعية, the indications of words by their placed meanings, right? That's why, that's what they look at. The other indications, they will consider them insofar as you bring them down to definitions. So someone says, so do you agree to this contract? They say, say, what do you mean by They say, I have some objections. So say, okay, I have some objections I can accept as a logical statement, right? Right? And here, page 138 of the Natijatul Mubham, there's a nice quote from al-Bannani, one of the commentators on the Sullam, that they chose this because this is the most precise way of understanding meanings, by the placed meanings of words. How are they placed? Either in the language or in usage, or by the definition given for them, right? And that serves as a precise building block for rational, for reason, for definitions and reasoning and arguments. right? And there's a nice discussion there, right? But don't get lost in the footnotes. So what's sought is a dilala, al-lafdiyya, the indication of words by their placed meanings, not by what's understood naturally or rationally from them. فَقَوْلُنَا اللَّفْظِيَّ مُخْرِجٌ لِغَيْرِ اللَّفْظِيَّ. Are saying verbal excludes non-verbal meanings of all three types. بِأَقْسَامِهَا الثَّلَاثَةِ. Whether by their place meanings like nods and fist bumps and thumbs up or thumbs down, or naturally, such as coughing or crying, or rationally, as we've seen. وَقَوْلُنَا الْوَضْعِيَّ, by their placement, مُخْرِجٌ لِلْلَفْظِيَّ الطَّبِعِيَّ وَالْعَقْلِيَّ, and are saying verbal placed meanings excludes the indications of words that are natural or rational, right? So this can be diagrammed, right? So there's one category so indication is lafzi or ghayr lafzi. Both of these are of three types: wad'i, tab'i, and aqli. By the placed meaning, by their conventional meaning, by their natural meaning, and by their rational meaning. So there's 6 types of indications of verbal, rational, natural, and conventional, and non-verbal, rational, natural, conventional. Of the 6, only one is of consideration for the logicians, which is the indication of words conventionally, right? وضعية. ثم هذه الدلالة ثلاثة أقسام. Now the conventional indication of words, الدلالة اللفظية الوضعية, is of 3 types: مطابقية وتضمنية والتزامية. Right? The conventional indication of words, when you say A is B, the relationship between A and B is of 3 types: correspondence, or partitive, مطابقة, or تضمن, or التزام, or of being entailed. فالأول أي المطابقية, the relationship of correspondence, and these are all precious definitions, right? And they're very good, clear definitions. فالأولى أي المطابقية, the relationship of correspondence. A is B, meaning B equals A, is دلالة اللفظ على تمام ما وضع له, is the indication of a word for its complete meaning. Say, the human being is a rational animal. Rational animal corresponds fully to the meaning of the word, right? The relation between insan and al-hayawan al-natiq is of mutabaqa. B corresponds to A fully. والثانية أي التضمنية دلالته على الجزء المعنى في ضمنه. The partitive relationship is a word indicating part of its meaning. كدلالته على الحيوان, to say the human is an animal. True, animal is part of the meaning of the human being. أو الناطق في ضمن الحيوان الناطق, say the human being is rational. That's part of the definition. والثالثة أي الالتزامية, the relationship of what is entailed by it, دلالته على أمر خارج عن المعنى لازم له is for a word to indicate a meaning, a word to indicate a matter outside of its meaning itself, but is necessarily entailed by it. كدلالته على قبول العلم. Right? That if you say the الإنسان قابل للعلم, the human can know. Right? This is entailed by there being a rational. That does not define the human being. It's entailed by the reality of the human being. وصنعة الكتابة. The human being can write. Writing, it does not make a human being, such that if someone can't write, they're still human. So it's not it being able to know or being able to write is entailed by the meaning of being human. It's not the reality of being human. And he says, على ما فيه. Right? Right? Says, despite what is problematic about this expression, على ما فيه, is, they call this صيغ التبري. And the author of the Hashiyah here touches upon that nicely. Right? But it's good enough for a beginner. وهذا معنى قوله دلالة اللفظ البيتين. And this is what he meant by these two lines that we have seen. Right? So how do words indicate meanings? Then he says سميت الأولى دلالة المطابقة. The first of the indication is called دلالة المطابقة, the indication of correspondence. A is B because B equals A. لمطابقة الفهم للوضع اللغوي, because what the meaning understood fully corresponds to the lexical sense of the word. لأن الواضع وضع اللفظ ليدل على المعنى بتمامه, because the one who placed this meaning for the word used it to indicate this meaning in full. وَقَدْ فَهِمْنَاهُ مِنْهُ. And we understood that meaning from it. The human being is a rational animal. We understood the meaning of a human from this statement. والثانية دلالة التضمن. والثانية دلالة التضمن أي سميت الثانية دلالة التضمن. The second was called the partitive indication لأن الجزء في ضمن الكل, because this is part of the whole. The human being is rational. The human being is an animal. والثالثة دلالة الالتزام. The third type of indication has been called دلالة الالتزام, the relationship, it's the entailed indication, it's entailed by it. لأن المفهوم خارج عن المعنى لازم له, because what is understood is outside the meaning but necessarily entailed by it. The Prophet ﷺ was asked, what is faith? He said, it's to greet others and feed others and to pray at night while others are asleep. None of these are faith itself, nor are they part of faith, but it's entailed by faith. However, for the logicians, only one type of entailed meaning is of consideration. وَقَوْلُهُ إِن بِعَقْلٍ الْتُزِمْ, if this meaning is rationally entailed. أشار به إلى أن اللازم لابد أن يكون لازما في الذهن. Right? He points to that if entailed rationally, he points to the fact that what is this meaning that is entailed for it to be considered dilalat iltizam, according to logicians, has to be entailed rationally, meaning in the mind. سواء لازم مع ذلك في الخارج, even whether it is actual externally, كلزوم الزوجية للأربعة, that if you say this is 4, it entails that it is even. أم لا, or if it's not actually there externally, كلزوم البصر للعمى, like the relationship between seeing and blindness. Because affirming seeing would entail that there's a meaning called non-seeing. So there's a rational relationship between the two. And that is broken down further elsewhere, but the dilalat al-iltizam are, they have a degree of nuance that will be coming, right? أما إذا كان لازما في الخارج فقط, if there's something that's only externally entailed, كسواد الغراب, such as a crow being black, فلا يسمى فهمه من اللفظ دلالة التزام, then it's being understood from the word is not called دلالة التزام. It's not entailed. Why? Because it is not something rationally true. If you conceive of a crow, the fact that a crow is black is not something that's rationally entailed. Right? And this is very powerful, right? Because if you conceive of the reality of the crow, you can conceive of the crow being any color. Its being black is simply an external attribute of it. Could you have an albino crow? Yeah. Is it a crow if it's albino? Yes. Right? So, a logician, if they acted logically, would not be surprised at the existence of a black swan. Why? Because it's not rationally true. But logicians, if they behave logically, would divest themselves of a lot of assumptions. Because a lot of things we assume that this entails this. No, that's only customarily true. Rationally, it doesn't have to be. Right? So it's that which is rationally entailed by something. That is a rational indication of something. The fact that it's customarily true, right? And that leads to a lot of poor thinking. And we'll expand on that further. But people jump to conclusions, right? Even in day-to-day thinking, so that it has applications. Like logic is not, so for example, Shaykh so-and-so is coming to town. Means I have to go visit him. No. Is that iltizam aqli? What kind of entailment is it? Right? It's customarily true. But is that a custom that applies to me? Well, people are doing it. That's not a rational thing. Right? So what is the indication, the relationship between scholar is coming to town, I have to go visit him. Right? We make leaps of reason. Right? فلا يسمى فهمه من اللفظ دلالة التزام. So saying a crow is black is not دلالة التزام, because it's not something understood rationally. It is the external quality of a crow. عند المناطق, according to the scholars of logic. وإن كان يسمى وإن سمي بذلك عند الأصوليين. Even if the scholars of usul considered it such. Because the scholars of usul said no, that which is customarily true would also be considered it being entailed. But they would note that this is customarily true. Right? It is not rationally necessary, but it's customarily true. but to be able to identify what's the nature of the relationship. Is it rational or customary? Either way, it is not logically entailed. Right? A does not necessarily indicate B according to reason. The logicians say a crow could be any color. The biologists say the crows are black. So yeah, that's what you've observed. Yeah, there's a lot of implications. فالباء في قوله بعقل بمعنى في. So the ba in his saying in بعقل التزم, if entailed by the intellect, meaning in the intellect, by the mind, by mean if it is entailed in the mind. والمراد بالعقل الذهن أي القوة المدركة. And what's meant by the intellect here is the mind, meaning the capacity of cognition. The capacity of cognition. And there's some interesting discussions in the Hashia about this, because language and expression deals with what normally is, right? And according to the scholars of language and the scholars who look at the indications of texts, in the language, the relation A is entailed by B is much wider than the logicians. But being able to have multiple points of thinking that, well, in the Arabic language, this is entailed in the language. Is this an indication that's accepted by the standards of usul al-fiqh, of the principles of deriving meaning from texts? But logicians say yes, but that's customarily true. But it's not necessarily the case. So just proceed with awareness. And these train us. So then he just explains something out a little bit, telling us that ثم إن كل من دلالة التضمن والالتزام يستلزم دلالة المطابقة. That both the partitive indication and the relationship of entailment, دلالة التضمن والالتزام, entails or requires, يستلزم requires a relationship of correspondence, دلالة المطابقة. Because وهي لا تستلزمهما, but there being a relationship of correspondence, A is B, does not entail that there be a partitive relationship or something entailed. Because كما إذا كان المعنى بسيطا ولا لازم له, if something is a singular meaning and it does not have implications, doesn't have things entailed by it. A simple example of that, for example, is Iman. What is Iman? وفسر الإيمان بالتصديق, confirmation. Iman is a معنى بسيط, is a singular manner. Is it made up of parts? No, it's بسيط. So there being دلالة مطابقة, a relationship of correspondence between Iman and تصديق, means that it does not have دلالة تضمن. It is not made up of parts. باعتبار نفس الإيمان, insofar as there's Iman itself. And they can be things that have no implications, meaning no rational implications. And deliberately doesn't give an example here. ودلالة التضمن, right, قد تجتمع مع دلالة الالتزام. And the relationship of تضمن, of the partitive relationship, could be found with دلالة الالتزام, with the relationship of entailment. فيما إذا كان المعنى مركبا, if a meaning is composite, made up of parts, human being, rational, animal. So animal is a partitive relationship of insan. وَلَهُ لَازِمٌ ذِهْنِ, and it has things that are entailed rationally, such as قابل للعلم, it is fit to know. وتنفرد دلالة التضمن فيما إذا كان المعنى مركبا ولا لازم له ذهنيا. But the partitive relationship is found on its own without the relationship of entailment if the meaning is composite, made up of two parts, but it does not have any rational consequence. Rational entailment. وتنفرد دلالة الالتزام, and the دلالة الالتزام, the relation of entailment, is found on its own فيما إذا كان المعنى بسيطا, if the meaning is singular, like كالنقطة, such as the dot. وله لازم ذهني, right? But it has rational implications, like the dot, right? A line is made up of a sequence of dots, right? Etc. Or iman, it has consequences, but it's not made up of parts. So he breaks this down. So we're getting to, right? Because it is by words that you're able to conceive of meanings, right? Meanings are known by definition. So today, what did we see? That logic looks at دلالة اللفظ الوضعية, the indication of words in their conventional meanings. That's what logicians look at. دلالة اللفظ الوضعية, the indication of words in their conventional usages. And there are different types of convention. We'll look at that separately. Then, so it excludes non-verbal indications, which are of three types. Conventional non-verbal indications, natural non-verbal indications, rational non-verbal indications. None of them are looked at in a non-verbal sense by logicians. Someone presents it non-verbally, the logician says, can we translate it into words? Someone goes, okay. Can we turn into words? Okay, now we can proceed. The indication of words is also rational, aqli, or tab'i, or natural, or conventional, wad'i. They look at دلالة اللفظ الوضعية. So one of six. The conventional indication of words. That's what logicians look at. Words indicate meanings at three levels. They indicate it completely, which is called دلالة التضمن. دلالة الشيء على تمام معنى. Something indicating its full meaning. إنسان حيوان عاقل. Human being, rational animal. Full indication. Or this is called correspondence. مطابقة. Right? Or, secondly, دلالة التضمن, something indicating part of its meaning. دلالة, so say the human is an animal. True, but that's only part of the meaning of the human. دلالة الشيء على جزء معناه, the indication of something to part of its meaning. Or iltizam, where something indicating a meaning outside of it, but entailed by it. So it's saying the human being has the capacity, the human can know. Yeah. That's not from the reality of the human being, it's something, it's outside of the reality of the human being, of the meaning of human being, but entailed by it. And then he talked about where these meanings are found together and when one can be found without the others. Next, which we'll look at next week, he looks at مباحث الألفاظ, that words can be further classified into used and non-used words. Logicians are only interested in words that are used, right? And then words can be singular or composite, right? And then there are words that indicate meanings, right? Right? Then indicate meanings in different ways. So he'll look at here, the singular word can be kulli, it can be categorical, or juz'i. So a singular word can indicate a category, a categorical meaning, kulli, or a partial meaning, juz'i, or it can be a composite meaning, and we'll see lines. What's the relationship between kulli and juz'i and kul and juz? Kulli and juz'i is like there being a category, the human, and I'm human and you're human, and presumably those who are online are human. So the word insan is a kulli, each of the particular, that's a category, and the particulars are, that's the relationship between the kulli and the juz'i. So Omar is human, and Zayn is human, and Hamza is human, and hopefully the others online are humans. Any jinn are welcome too, but I'm not sure if jinn use Zoom. The relation between the kul and the juz, the whole and its parts, the whole is made up of its parts. So, this glass, this cup is glass and cork. So this is kul. This is made, and it has parts, right? So we look at these two, and they have implications. We'll see why they look at that. After that, because that helps us then. Why do we classify things in this way? Because that helps us then conceive of things so that we can start talking about the so we can start talking about the kulliyat al-khams, the 5 ways that we can go about defining terms, right? So we're getting, so logic is taken in its bits. You have to catch each bit because they build up together to get to terms, and then to definitions, and then to arguments. بإذن الله تعالى. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
There's a question on Aqidah from a previous session on page 199, footnote 2. Is it appropriate to say that Qudra follows the irada in terms of zaman, or do we have to specify that we are talking about the ta'alluq tanjizi of Qudra?
Is it appropriate to say Qudra follow? First thing, just take as a principle, don't say anything about Allah or His attributes or His actions other than what is affirmed in revelation, as affirmed, or with the language and usage and expressions of the Imams of this science, right? Because وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنِ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. So don't make up your own expressions, right? That's what. And what you see by those who are trained in this science is that they speak with the utmost precision. That's what we've seen from Shaykh Adib Kallas, from Shaykh Hassan al-Hindi, from the other scholars, right? And they also have from Shaykh Mu'min al-Annan, and they have the utmost caution about how they talk about these matters, because anything you say has implications, right? As our brief dipping into logic tells us, right? so sort of paraphrasing this and that. Very often this is mental shorthand, and there's an element of laziness there. It's kind of like this. No. Did anyone say this in this way? That's why Shaykh Adib, almost annoyingly, would always take that. He would always remind us, تُعْرَفُ الْأُمُورِ بِتَعْرِيفِهَا. Matters are known by their definition. So you ask him a question, say, what is the definition of this? If someone said, ask him, why are there 3 relationships for Allah's hearing? So he asks, firstly, what is the definition of hearing? The attribute of hearing. Okay? Secondly, what is a ta'alluq? Okay? So you understand the definition of hearing, you understand the definition of ta'alluq. So okay, write A out, write B out precisely. Because if you come up with your own definition, you'll miss some key element. So if you just apply that for a second, ta'alluq, what is the definition of sama'? Of hearing? صفة وجودية قائمة بذاته تعالى. It's صفة وجودية قديمة. It's an eternal, existent attribute subsisting through the entity of Allah. زائد عليها, that is more than the entity itself. تتعلق بالموجودات تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف, that relates to existent things with the relationship of encompassing and indication. If you understand that, then what are its indications? You don't even have to know the text. If you were to think clearly, of course you have to be trained to think clearly. People aren't born typically with fully clear thinking. Abu Hanifa said to Abu Yusuf, you were dull and we made you intelligent. And he said similarly to Muhammad al-Hasan. And he gave Abu Yusuf a hard time. Abu Yusuf had permission from him to teach once he started teaching a class on the other edge of town, but without asking his teacher's permission. This is when he was already a distinguished scholar. So Abu Yusuf, and he was coming daily to study Abu Hanifa, but he sent him questions through a messenger and requested that the answers be sent through the messenger, not in person. He answered, and he said, "You're wrong." So he answered the other way around, said, "You're wrong." Then he went in person and said, "Imam, you asked this question, I answered this way, you said it's wrong." So I answered the other way, you said it's wrong. He said, "No, there's detail. So there's nuance." Anyways, here, if you know the definition of the divine attribute of hearing, and you know what is ta'alluq, اقتضاء الصفة معنى زائد عن قيامها بالذات. So ta'alluq, therefore, is the نوع التعلق, the type of relationship, which is إحاطة وانكشاف, indication and disclosure, and نوع التعلق, yeah, and then what type, what does it relate, المتعلق به, what does it relate to? The existent things. So you know, existent things are الموجود, existent things are all the necessary, والممكن الذي سيوجد, the existent things and the possible things that will exist. So therefore Allah's hearing actually relates to the eternal, because there's no potentiality with respect to the eternal, right? So it actually relates to the eternal existent, right? So, but then the possible things before they exist, the possible existent things before they exist, it relates to them potentially, eternally, Saluhi, Qadim, and then the existent, the possible things that when they exist, Allah's hearing relates to them actually, temporally. Tanjisi hadith. But how do we come to that? Say, why does it have three relationships? Say, okay, what is A and what is B? What is Allah's hearing? What is its attachment? Then you understand. So someone asks, what is it true to say Saluhi is this? And okay, what do you mean by Saluhi? What do you mean by Tanjizi? What do you mean by Hadith? Define everything, and you'll be close to the answer. And that's how we need to train ourselves to think. But of course, you ask that, okay, I want to clarify this. Of course, the worst of questions say, A and B, is it correct? Because what you're saying has this huge nexus of indications. So say, correct? Like, unless you're an authority that you speak in the most precise of ways, saying correct, like, what do you want me to correct? When you don't even type the word properly, right? So, we need to be precise. We need to be precise. And that's the nature of the ulama. So one of my good friends, Shaykh Ahmad Snowball, was a hadith scholar. We have a common teacher. He said, I've been attending his classes for over 2 decades, and I've never heard him relate a hadith except with the transmitted wording. And any time he's narrated a hadith that has weakness, he will mention its weakness. He says, I get so happy when that happens. I said, did you pay attention to the hadith he quoted? He says, no, I was just amazed at the fact that he mentioned that it has weakness, and I went and checked, and that's the stronger of multiple opinions. That's ilm. Right? And of course, that is not sought in itself. لا يعول عليه. Ultimately, what's sought from the ilm is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah has commanded us to give the ilm its due. Any other questions? So for the logic class, it's very, very important to be, there's 2 things. One, it's the same method. Write out the method itself, take the key points, especially the definitions from the commentary. The extra things, they're secondary. Number 2, you got to diagram it. There's no way around diagramming it. That's it. That's all it takes. You just have to, like, how do you climb a mountain? You don't climb a mountain. You take steps. That's all. Right? You climb a mountain by taking successful step after successful step after successful step. All you have to worry is keep taking the steps. إنما حرم الوصول لتضييعهم الأصول وتركهم الاقتداء بدليل. They're only prevented from reaching because they squandered the foundational principles and they did not follow a guide. That applies in knowledge and in other things too. Okay, so we'll begin in 5 minutes.